Scott Stossel is a wreck. Along with about 40 million Americans, he suffers from anxiety. He has panic attacks, a long list of phobias, and a nervous stomach. It started when he was very little. Scott says that since about the age of 2, he's been a twitching bundle of phobias, fears, and neuroses. He's tried all kinds of things, therapy, meditation, drugs, but the fear and dread always come back. Scott Stossel has written his story, as well as the history of anxiety disorder, in a book called My Age of Anxiety, and he joins me in the studio. Scott, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
How do you feel now?
Moderately anxious, but basically okay.
In your book, you talk about this long list of things that you do before you speak in public.
My pregame regimen, yes.
There's drugs, there's vodka, there's the little mini bar thing of alcohol.
Yep. I do not have the mini bar bottle of alcohol in my pocket right now. But no, when I did an event a couple of days ago, and I mean, it used to be that I would dread for 6 months in advance any kind of public speaking engagement, and like sleepless nights. I would get panic attacks. Actually, I remember before my first book came out 10 years ago, I was watching Mean Girls, the Lindsay Lohan movie, light comedy of all things, and I was watching the Tim Meadows character, who was the principal of the school, was giving a public speech to an audience, and I had a panic attack simply watching this fictional character on this silly movie giving a speech, thinking, oh my God, I'm going to have to be doing that. I've now gotten better at sort of titrating my dosages of benzodiazepines, which are anti-anxiety medications, and in severe situations, a little bit of alcohol on top of that, which is not doctor recommended, and I am not a physician. I do not advocate this, but for me, it usually works.
So did you do all that?
I did a modest version of that. I've been on book tour now for about 2 weeks, and so
you're just getting used to it.
It's always hard to predict in any given situation how much anxiety there will be. So I pre-medicated with a little bit of Xanax, but forewent the alcohol this time.
What if you medicate too much?
That's a real fear. I mean,
could you fall asleep during an interview, or
what
happens?
I've never. Maybe I will. I'm very tired. Maybe I will today. But that wouldn't be the vodka. That's never happened. I did once have to give a talk at Notre Dame, and it's all usually. I'm very good at sort of titrating the exact amount of dosage that I need to kind of balance out the sort of hyper-physiological arousal caused by the anxiety and the kind of sedating effects of the medication. But oftentimes I do that, and then I need to go and have a nap afterwards. And I went out to Notre Dame again for my first book, and I had to give a talk to a bunch of students, and I got through that. And then I had to go to a dinner where I had to make a presentation, and I got through that, and I had a little bit of wine. And then I was supposed to do a panel with a senator at the end of the movie. And I sat down to the movie, and suddenly I was sound asleep, and they woke me up, and I have no idea what I said when I woke up, but people said I was brilliant, which was reassuring. But that's a disconcerting thing, because if I'm achieving sort of partial blackouts during these events,
sure,
that's a very worrisome situation.
Can you define anxiety for us?
Sure. I mean, I struggle a lot in the book to find the right definition, and the definitions have evolved so much over the years. The anxiety disorders didn't exist officially until 1980, when the DSM-3 inscribed them into the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual as the sort of Bible of the American Psychiatric Association. But anxiety is basically, one of my therapists says, it is anticipation of some future event that we are helpless to prevent, and that can be an external event or some internal fear. And basically in people who have both normal anxiety and people who have sort of pathological clinical anxiety or anxiety disorders, the physiological and cognitive response that you have in anxiety is basically a fight or flight response, which is an evolutionarily adaptive response that equipped you in the state of nature or not in the state of nature to, if you're being attacked by a saber-toothed tiger, to run or to flee, or if you're being attacked by a member of an alien tribe, it causes blood to flow to your limbs, away from your stomach, your visual perception increases, and in those situations, it's highly adaptive. In people who have anxiety disorder, or when they're in the throes of a panic attack or suffering severe anxiety in the midst of something triggered by a phobic stimulus, in effect, it's a misfiring fight or flight response. That is, either there's nothing truly to be afraid of, or your response is disproportionate to the threat at hand, and you end up sort of marinating in this stew of stress hormones that makes you feel physically and cognitively awful.
Scott Stossel is in the studio with me. He's an author and the editor of The Atlantic magazine. His book is called My Age of Anxiety: Fear, Hope, Dread, and the Search for Peace of Mind. Why do you think so many Americans suffer from anxiety?
Good question. I mean, based on now having read extensively both in the sort of modern scientific literature and back through history, I think that there have throughout all of history, going back to the 4th century BC, when you have the Hippocrates, the ancient doctor, writing about it, that there has always been some component or some relatively fixed portion of the human population that is genetically, temperamentally disposed to excessive anxiety. And I mean, it's fascinating reading his accounts in the 4th century BC of people who would today be diagnosed with panic disorder or phobia or social anxiety. So I think that there is sort of a fixed quotient of anxiety or of people, unusually prone to anxiety that exists throughout all time. But then there are certain eras that, because of a variety of factors, are more productive of anxiety. So, and a lot of the era we're living through today has a lot of those hallmarks, which is to say, rapid social transformation, rapid technological change, vast, economic uncertainty in general. For people with anxiety and even people who don't have clinical anxiety, uncertainty is incredibly anxiety producing. And there's even a researcher at Penn State who thinks that uncertainty, the feeling of uncertainty, actually rewires your brain to be more anxious, which makes you feel more uncertainty, which creates more uncertainty, which makes you more anxious. But in the United States today, you have the combination of uncertainty, rapid social change, and also, and this is a net good thing, but lots of political and economic free choice. So you can walk into a grocery store and you're overwhelmed by which of 57 breakfast cereals do you buy. You can decide, for the most part, what career do you choose, who do you marry, what kind of personal identity do you want to adopt. And these are all things that, say, in the Middle Ages, where life was probably, there are a lot more things to legitimately be afraid of. You're probably going to die of pellagra or something at age 8. But you didn't almost have the luxury of anxiety because you didn't have any choice. Everything, all decisions were kind of made for you in advance. So there's a sense in which the free choice combined with uncertainty, it makes us all super anxious.
So, what's the consensus now on whether anxiety is caused by a chemical imbalance in the brain? Is it rooted in biology?
My view is that it's largely rooted, that some component of it is rooted in biology, and it's sort of encoded into your genes. And certain people have a temperament that makes them more predisposed to anxiety, and other people have a set of genes that make them particularly resilient to it.
So you think it's genetic as well?
Well, I think there's a strong genetic underpinning, but that one has to be wary about sort of reducing everything to the gene. So it's not completely genetic. So, for instance, if you are a member of an identical twin pair and you have, say, panic disorder, your twin is vastly more likely to also have panic disorder than an average member of the population, but they're not guaranteed to have it, which sort of proves that there are, on top of this sort of genetic biological basis, there's your upbringing, have you suffered trauma, your life circumstances, luck, the culture you live in, all kinds of things play into it.
What was your childhood like?
I mean, for the most part, I was grew up in an upper middle class home. My mother was a lawyer. My father was a doctor. We had a roof over our heads. I didn't have, most people in most of the world have lives of much greater hardship and stress, which in some ways makes it feel, all the more, pathetic and shameful to me that I, grew up to, suffer from these acute anxieties. But that's quite typical. There was something, and I talk in the book a lot about the parenting styles that my parents had. And, my mother in particular had the classic anxiogenic, as they call it, parenting style of being vastly overprotective, very much a worrier herself. She sort of emits an almost like audible nervous thrum, with sort of overprotection with not, vast, manifest displays of affection. Both my parents were very loving. They tried very hard to do the best they could. When my anxieties got very bad when I was 10 years old and they took me to a psychiatric hospital to be evaluated, they immediately put me into therapy. They went into therapy themselves with a social worker to try to figure out how to be better parents. But there was something about the combination of, both parents were high achieving, but my mother was anxious. My father was a little bit distant. And
so you think you absorbed that anxiousness from your mother just because if your mother's very anxious, you start to feel like, wow, there's something to be afraid of. I don't know what it is, but I'm afraid of something.
Exactly, and that's classic. And it's the psychological term for that is modeling. You sort of learn your anxiety from watching other people. But in the book, what I do is I use myself, in effect, as a case study to look at all these different theories about and treatments for anxiety. And so, in talking about my family and wrestling with the nature-nurture question, one could conclude, from my mother was incredibly anxious. Her mother was incredibly anxious. Her paternal grandfather who was actually dean of Harvard College and a very successful man, ended up being hospitalized multiple times in middle age for acute anxiety and depression. So it could have been, each successive generation modeled for the one after it, this anxiety. And my own kids, much to my heartbreak, are starting to have developed signs of anxiety disorder. But it's also possible that that's largely genetic, and that my great grandfather passed it to down through his father to my mother, and my mother to me, and and have lots of hard won personal knowledge of anxiety. In writing the book for 8 years, I probably know as much about it, the neuromechanics of anxiety, as any layperson, and yet here my kids are exhibiting signs of some of the same phobias that I have at the same ages. So clearly, either I'm unconsciously transmitting these things, or it's sort of woven into the genes.
You said that you were 10 when you were actually diagnosed.
Yeah.
But at what age did you feel like, there's something wrong? I'm not like other kids.
Good question. I mean, I don't know at what point I realized. I thought in terms of, am I different from other kids? I definitely realized from a very young age that I often felt in great distress if I was separated from my parents. I mean, starting at age 3. And at age 3, separation anxiety is a normal developmental stage.
Sure.
A lot of kids have trouble separating. But I was on the sort of more acute end of the spectrum. And then what was different for me is, the other kids were able to go to school when they were 6, 7, 8, 9. I went to school, but I would end up in the nurse's office every day when I was 6 years old, it was a headache every day. When I was 7 years old, it was a stomach ache. And then by the time, I was even into my early teens, anytime my parents would go to a party for the night or something, if they were not even late, if they were a half hour when they were supposed to be home, I would become acutely convinced that they had died in a car crash or that they had left and abandoned me. And my poor sister, who's 2 years younger than me, I would make her call. This was pre-cell phone era, so I'd make them call the party to see if my parents were still alive. And a couple of times I would get in such distress that I would, literally, and this was embarrassing to my parents when I was 9. When I was, 13, it was sort of mortifying. And I'd go to the neighbors' houses and knock on the door and say, I think my parents are dead. This was completely irrational. They were 2 miles away at some suburban cocktail party. But I had this utter conviction that they had died. So from probably about age 7, this anxiety was sort of a tiring part of my existence. It's gone now, but if you went back to my childhood rug in my bedroom, there were grooves in the carpet because I would just, whenever I was nervous and my parents weren't coming home, I would walk in circles again and again and again and pace, and I paced grooves in the carpet.
The book we're discussing is called My Age of Anxiety, Fear, Hope, Dread, and the Search for Peace of Mind. Scott Stossel is an author and the editor of The Atlantic magazine. There are phobias for everything, but I was surprised to find that a phobia of vomiting is actually pretty common as far as phobias go. Why?
They don't know exactly why, and people didn't realize how common it was until the age of the internet, because everyone, the most commonly shared phobias and anxieties tend to be fear of public speaking, fear of flying, and then after that you've got things like snakes and rats, claustrophobia, some of which get combined in flying. But by some estimates, and those estimates being, the number of members of these sort of online forums, emetophobia may be the 5th most common. And there's a bunch of theories for why. The research is sort of in its early stages. It seems to be connected to a fear of loss of control. I mean, it's something, you can run away from a snake, you can avoid them, but if you have a stomach virus or have food poisoning, it's your own body sort of reacting against you. And so there's some evidence that people with emetophobia, as the fear of vomiting is called, have an acute fear of loss of control. Interestingly, far more women than men seem to suffer from it. I'm obviously an exception here, although it's been reported that Matt Lauer, the host of the Today Show, may have suffered with it among a number of other celebrities. I looked into this in the book too, because my daughter developed. So my mother had this phobia. I always assumed I learned it from watching her. She hadn't thrown up since 1974 and was sort of a germaphobe, and I just assumed I absorbed this from her. Cognizant of that, I tried to hide and I think I did actually successfully hide it from my daughter until at age 7, exactly the age when this fear became most acute for me. She developed it very suddenly, like almost overnight. Someone in her class got sick, and she stopped wanting to go to school. She lost weight. She wouldn't eat.
It really bothered her.
And so how is it that my wife and I were sort of horrified and fascinated that could a phobia as idiosyncratic as that be transmitted? Now, it may be that actually it's an adaptive to be afraid of other people vomiting, because if you were in the state of nature and there was some toxin in the atmosphere, And other people,
It
you
can
want
make you
to
sick.
you want to run away from whatever it is that is poisoning them. But it's an adaptive response, and as unpleasant it is, it shouldn't be a phobic inducing thing. And the amount of my life that I spend worrying about it, trying to avoid it, is hugely disproportionate to the amount of time I spend actually doing it.
Because you actually don't vomit very much at all.
No, I mean, I've gotten stomach virus and things, and I'm always, I have a nervous stomach because when I get nervous, as many people do, there's a very direct, they call it the brain gut axis. So, I mean, that's again the infernal thing about being an anxious emetophobe is that you're nervous about, getting sick, then you get nervous, you feel sick, and then you can actually bring on the thing you fear the most.
There's a really interesting story in your book about prisoners in a Nazi concentration
Mm-hmm.
camp. Their neuroses and phobias all disappeared,
Yep.
which is counterintuitive because that's a very stressful situation,
Yeah.
obviously. I mean,
Yep.
they know that they're going to get killed,
Yep.
that they're going to suffer and die, but they're not phobic anymore. They're not anxious.
This study was fascinating to me. It's by a doctor named V.A. Krall, who himself was in the concentration camp. And there's a couple of other studies that show similar things. During World War II, during the Blitz of London, a lot of neurotic people reported that their level of anxiety went down. They stopped, visiting their psychiatrists. So there's a couple of reasons why this may be. I mean, it's again sort of the theory that if you have real things to be afraid of, you no longer have the luxury of neurotic anxieties.
It just kind of crowds it out.
It crowds it out. Another theory is that many people, particularly sort of high functioning people with anxiety, they're so worried that they're going to be their anxiety or their neurosis will be revealed that when everyone's running around being appropriately afraid of bombs falling on their head, suddenly everyone else, it's not, they don't have to hide it anymore because it's appropriate to be afraid. There's some controversy that so in that concentration camp study, basically what he reported, he found is that there were no new instances of anxiety, depression, or there was depression, but of anxiety or neurosis. And then afterwards, some of them returned.
After they survived.
After they survived. But that maybe, most of the literature on PTSD, which is a form of anxiety disorder, suggests that situations of extreme hardship or trauma actually produce anxiety. And a psychologist I was talking to the other day said there's a reason why there's a P, that it's post, and so that it may, actually, it may be they didn't study these folks later on. It may be that their anxiety actually deepened, years after the experience.
Did anything like that happen to you, where when you're actually genuinely afraid, then your anxiety goes away?
Well, sort of. I'll tell you one story. I mean, people do talk about how at work, some people, when I came out with this book and came out as anxious as it were, most of my colleagues were like, we had no idea. And I mean, I think I was surprised the extent to which most of them really did have no idea. I mean, I think some of them had an inkling. But most people are very good at hiding it. And partly it's because, since I'm always so, I can seem unflappable in actually really stressful situations because internally I'm also sort of internally flapped. And so it's not that different when there's a real crisis. There was a time, and I talk about this in my book, in the summer of 2010, a horrible tornado actually dropped down in the backyard of our house. And I was in the house. Fortunately, my wife and kids were away. And the house literally, I woke up, things are flying at the window. I have no idea what's going on. I don't know.
This is the middle of the night.
It's like 6 a.m,
Okay.
just before 7 a.m. And I'm wondering and basically the roof collapses. All of the windows in the back of the house sort of explode inward. And I'm thinking, is this an alien invasion, nuclear attack? There had been no weather forecast about a Katrina type event. And so I run to the basement, and I'm standing on the edge of the basement, and the basement is filling with water because it's raining, and there's no roof on the house anymore. And I'm sort of irrationally thinking a couple things. One of which is I'm remembering the trash compactor scene from Star Wars where they're going to drown. The other is I'm wearing my boxer shorts. I'm like, maybe I better put on some pants because what if the whole house blows away? But I'm standing there on the edge of the basement, and I can feel my heart pumping, and I'm genuinely scared because it's legitimately scary like that. I literally, the roof of my kitchen suddenly became the kitchen floor 5 feet from me. But even as I was sort of sitting there, I was thinking, this is not as bad as a panic attack. And sure enough, a couple nights later, so I actually had to move out of the house. It was condemned, insurance came. And I had a panic attack a couple nights later. So I don't know, which was, far worse, even though I'm just sitting in a safety of a hotel room and my stomach hurts. And I'm like, it was much more acute than having my house literally falling down around me. And I quote a guy, David Sheen is a psychiatrist who's treated anxiety for many, many years. And he talks about how he had a patient who had been one of the people who first stormed the beach at Normandy during D-Day. And I mean, talk about anxiety provoking. You're running onto the beach. People are dying all around you. Bullets are flying at you. And he had come to Dr. Sheehan with panic disorder. And Dr. Sheehan said, well, isn't that less, you had a panic attack at dinner the other night you were telling me about. Clearly that's not as bad as storming the beach at Normandy. And he said, no, I would much rather storm the beach at Normandy again than be sort of subject to the ravages of the neurocircuitry of my own mind sitting in the safety of this restaurant.
Scott Stossel's in the studio with me. He's an author and the editor of The Atlantic magazine. We're discussing his memoir. It's called My Age of Anxiety, Fear, Hope, Dread, and the Search for Peace of Mind. Let's talk about drugs. We talked briefly about it. There's the psychiatrists that are, as soon as they diagnose somebody with anxiety, they get out their pad, they say, these are the drugs you need to start taking. What success or otherwise have you had with those drugs?
Mixed. I mean, I will say that there are zealots on both sides of the drug issue, and I think both of them are operating in good faith. And I definitely am not on either side. I fall in the middle. I've taken a whole variety, since I've been suffering for this for now, 34 years or more, I've sort of gone through each of whatever the cutting edge class of anti-anxiety drugs was over the years. Some have worked better than others. Some of them work partially some of the time. And I will say that for me, the surest way of mitigating acute anxiety are benzodiazepines, which are Xanax, Klonopin, Ativan. I've also taken for much of the last, at this point going on 20 years, SSRI antidepressants, which are like Prozac, Paxil, Celexa. So I think they do work for some patients some of the time, and they should definitely be part of the psychotropic arsenal. But the critics on the sort of anti-pharma side, I have sympathy for what they say too, because on the one hand, some of them say that actually these drugs just make you worse. They're actually brain damaging us, or there's no long-term studies of what if you're on these drugs for 30 years, what does that actually do to your brain? They can be dependency forming. They have bad side effects. For many people, they don't work, and they view the big pharmaceutical companies as just sort of rapacious, profit-minded corporations who are trying to inflate the disease category so that every time, exactly. So for the famous example, there's two, but the most recent one, social phobia or social anxiety disorder didn't exist as a formal classification as a disease until 1980 with the issue of the DSM-3. And then for about 15 years after that, people weren't really diagnosed with it much. And then suddenly in the late 90s, millions of people were being diagnosed with it. What changed? Well, it was that the FDA approved the first drug to be specifically designated for social anxiety disorder, which was Paxil, and Paxil's SmithKline Beecham launched multi-hundred million dollar ad campaign, and suddenly millions of people are being diagnosed with it. Millions of people are taking drugs, and I do think that probably a lot of people get caught up in those diagnostic nets who don't need to be taking the drug. And there are a lot of questions too about what does it mean that so many people in our society are so heavily medicated? I mean, are we just maybe that the opiate of the masses are benzodiazepines and SSRI antidepressants. But all that said, I can say with hard-won personal experience and from reading around that, most of the people who are taking these drugs and who benefit from them are suffering from real clinical distress that is not just shyness in the case of social anxiety disorder or just sort of being typically worried. They have real issues here, and the anxiety takes the edge off.
Have you tried to go without medication at all?
There have been periods in my life when I most of my college career, for whatever reason, I still struggled with anxiety, but I was mostly not medicated. I would occasionally take anti-anxiety medication in acute circumstances. And then in my 20s, for a couple times, I would be off, but always I would sort of start to tip down, back into the anxiety, and then that would sort of sometimes come with associated with depression. And so for most of the last, if I started taking, so when I was 12, they actually prescribed me Thorazine, which at the time was sort of a major tranquilizer, frequently prescribed antipsychotic for schizophrenics, but also for anxiety, and Valium and imipramine, which was an early tricyclic antidepressant. And basically since then, what is that? So that was in sort of 1980. For the last 34 years, I've probably been medicated for 28 of them, give or take.
Your therapist, you call him Dr. W,
Mm-hmm.
He's convinced that he can heal you
Yeah.
of your anxiety. Do you think that you'll be healed?
I would like to think that I would be healed, or be fully cured. And I know plenty of people
Is that your
who
hope?
claim, yes, but I really what I would like to be able to do, and I think a more realistic goal, and I think Dr. W even would concede this, is that I can reduce my anxiety significantly. I can come to terms with it, which is part of what, and he was very encouraging to me in sort of writing the book and coming out about my anxiety, saying that that in itself would be therapeutic. He talks about he believes that many psychiatric issues in adults are a result of sort of core self wounds, and that if you can heal those, you will actually get better. I don't know if I'll ever be fully cured, but I'm trying to sort of learn to come to terms with my anxiety, recognizing that there are some redemptive qualities to it, and also that I can, there are techniques for managing it, and maybe in the fullness of time I will be cured.
Part of your anxiety stems from people finding out about it,
Yeah.
right? And then they'll say that you're weak, you're worthless, whatever. Now with this memoir, it's out.
Yeah.
So how do you feel?
The jury's still out. I mean, for the most part, it's been incredibly gratifying. I mean, it was, I had, as you might imagine, no small amount of ambivalence about coming out with all this stuff. But, I think there may be people who have nasty things to say, but they haven't been saying it to my face. And the people who I know have all said either, A, we had no idea, and I just want to give you a hug.
Yeah.
And then the really heartening thing is that, I've been inundated with people, some from people I know, but also, strangers, celebrities, just random people saying, thank you for writing this. I don't feel so alone. I understand this so much better. And I thought maybe it would have some of that effect, but I didn't realize, the full extent of it. And that's been incredibly gratifying and make me feel like writing the book was worthwhile. And even people who don't suffer from anxiety have read it and said, A, you've helped me understand and given me some empathy for people who I know who suffer from it, but also, anxiety is such an interesting window onto the human condition and how the mind works and the relationship between mind and brain and molecules and emotion. And so I feel like I've been very happy with how the book has been received.
Scott Stossel, he's an author, the editor of The Atlantic magazine. The book is My Age of Anxiety, Fear, Hope, Dread, and the Search for Peace of Mind. It's published by Knopf. Scott, thanks so much for being on the program.
Well, thank you very much for having me.